Hello, I'm John and welcome to John's Box. This is part 3 in my series Past, Present and Future of Civil Aviation, based on the fascinating book A History of Passenger Aircraft by William Smeaton, published by Hamlin. In this series, we're following the extraordinary story of passenger aviation from its uncertain beginnings through the great aircraft of the past to the technological developments that would eventually transform the way we travel around the world. In our first episode, we looked at the fledgling industry, the early years of commercial aviation, when passenger flying was still developing and aircraft were relatively small and comfortable and unreliable compared with the airliners we know today. In part 2, America surges ahead. We saw how the United States emerged as the dominant force in aircraft production and commercial aviation, particularly after the Second World War. Now in part 3 we arrive at one of the most important periods in the history of passenger aircraft, the age of the great piston engine. These were the magnificent aircraft that dominated the skies during the years immediately before the jet age. They were large, powerful, elegant, and technically very remarkable. They carried passengers across continents and oceans, and for many people they represented the very height of modern technology. But their era was surprisingly brief. Within only a few years, many of these magnificent piston-engine airliners would be overtaken by the jet aircraft that were waiting just around the corner. So let us take a look at the great piston airliners and the golden age of propeller-driven passenger aviation. But before we go into all the details, here's a quick word from me, John, your YouTube host. Hello, I'm John and welcome to, John's Box, my YouTube channel, and to the third of the 10 editions of the past, present and future of civil aviation, based on a book that I purchased donkeys years ago, The History of Passenger Aircraft. There it is. Unfortunately, I've long lost the cover to this. In the previous two editions, entitled The Fledgling Industry and America Surges Ahead. So we looked at the beginnings and mostly everything that was going on before the Second World War. Today also post-war, because it's about the great piston airliners, as you heard in the introduction. I hope you can just about see that. And you may be wondering, if you're not into the technical aspects of aviation about engines, the difference between a piston engine and a turboprop engine and a jet engine. More or less, turboprop and jets are quite similar in their uses and designs. Well, the piston engine in a plane is similar to the engine in your car, where fuel and air burns inside cylinders. The explosions push pistons up and down. The pistons turns like 6-7 a little bit. The pistons turn the crankshaft, and the crankshaft turns the propeller. So we go from piston engine to pistons to crankshaft and to propeller, as you can see in this diagram. And they're usually found in smaller, slower aircraft and are generally simpler and cheaper to operate. Even today, a lot of the light planes have got piston engines. Your turboprop engine, well, the turboprop is actually a type of gas turbine engine, similar in principle to a jet engine, like you've got, for example, in the Boeing 737s. For example, the Vickers-Viscount had a turboprop engine, and they're still flying today, many planes like the ATRs. In this case, the air enters the engine, it's compressed, the fuel is burned, the hot gases spin a turbine, and the turbine turns a propeller through a gearbox or the fans in a jet plane. A slightly different sound. So we go, a turboprop then is a turbine, gearbox, propeller, and the propeller produces most of the aircraft's thrust, while the engine itself produces a small amount of jet thrust. So those are the key differences between them. So to summarize, the piston has repeated explosions which move pistons, which turn the propeller, and the turboprop, a continuous flow of burning gases, spins a turbine which turns the propeller. The other thing is about pressurized cabins, which allow planes to fly above the weather. Some examples of piston engines are pressurized, in fact, but some and others are not. Let's say the Douglas Dakota DC-3 is not pressurized. All of the turboprops are. Of the piston engines which are pressurized, you've got the DC-6, the DC-7, and the Connie, the Lockheed Constellation, among other. I'm going to show you some of the pictures in the book from the Great Piston Airlines. Let's try and get through them. They got the DC-3 at the top, and then we've got here some DC-4s, and then you've got a Connie here, as you can see. One or two or three examples are still flying today. You've got the interior of one of my favourite planes, which is the Boeing Stratocruiser. There. Luxury airliner, although not particularly safe. And here you have a DC-6 as well, quite a successful airliner. And the last of the pistons, the DC-7, and the next one would be the DC-8, which was a jet engine, the Douglas's first jet engine. So in the rest of the video, we'll be talking about the golden age of the piston airliner, about the DC-6, about the DC-7 in more detail, the Lockheed and the Constellation, and the importance of the four-engine airliner in the shadow of the jet age. Then I'll summarize it, and at the end I'll be back for a short summary. So enjoy the rest of the video. The years following the Second World War were a remarkable period for civil aviation. During the war, aircraft technology had developed at an extraordinary speed. Engineers had gained experience with more powerful engines, better aerodynamics, pressurized cabins, improved navigation, and longer-range aircraft. When the war ended, much of this knowledge was transferred into the world of commercial aviation. The result was a new generation of passenger aircraft that were far more advanced than anything that had existed before the war. The basic piston engine airliner had evolved dramatically. These aircraft were larger, faster, and capable of flying much farther. They could carry dozens of passengers across oceans and continents, often in a degree of comfort that earlier generations of travellers could scarcely have imagined. For the airlines, these aircraft represented the opportunity to expand their networks. For passengers, they offered something even more exciting, the possibility of travelling across the world by air. One of the great stars of this period was the Douglas DC-6. The DC-6, developed from wartime experience, became one of the most successful long-range piston airliners of the post-war period. Compared with earlier aircraft, it offered greater range, improved performance, and a more comfortable passenger cabin. It was also pressurized, allowing it to fly at higher altitudes. This was important because higher altitudes generally offered smoother air and helped aircraft avoid much of the weather and turbulence found at lower levels. The DC-6 was used extensively by major airlines and became a familiar sight on the long-distance routes. It represented the maturity of the piston engine airliner. The technology had been refined, the engines were powerful and reliable, and airlines had developed the experience necessary to operate large fleets across international routes. For a time, aircraft like the DC-6 appeared to represent the future of commercial aviation. But another aircraft from Douglas was about to push the technology even further. The Douglas DC-7 was one of the final and most impressive developments of the large piston engine airliner. The aircraft was designed at a time when airlines were demanding greater range and faster journey times. The DC-7 was particularly important because it was capable of flying long distances, including transcontinental and transatlantic routes, at speeds that made air travel increasingly competitive with other forms of transport. The later DC-7C, sometimes known as the 7 Seas, was especially significant. It was designed with long-range international operations in mind and could undertake some transatlantic flights without the need for a stop. This was a major achievement. Passengers could now travel between continents more quickly and conveniently than ever before. The great piston airliners had reached an extraordinary level of development. Their engines were powerful, their cabins were pressurized, and their range was impressive. But ironically, by the time these aircraft reached their technical peak, the jet engine was already beginning to threaten their future. Another legendary aircraft of this era was the Lockheed Constellation. The Constellation was one of the most recognizable passenger aircraft ever built. Its distinctive triple-tail design gave it an appearance unlike any other airliner of its time. But the aircraft was much more than simply attractive. It was fast, pressurized, and capable of flying long distances. The Constellation became one of the great symbols of post-war air travel. It was used on important international routes and became closely associated with the glamour of the golden age of aviation. At a time when flying was still an expensive and relatively exclusive experience, traveling aboard a Constellation could feel like a special event. The aircraft helped establish the idea that long-distance air travel could be comfortable, sophisticated, and luxurious. The passenger cabin was not simply a means of getting from one place to another. Flying was an experience. Passengers dressed formally for their journeys. Meals were served on board. The aircraft themselves were often regarded as symbols of modernity, wealth, and progress. The great airliners of this period helped create the romantic image of the golden age of flying. A major theme of this period was the importance of four-engine aircraft. For long-distance flights, four engines offered a level of performance and security that was extremely important to airlines and passengers. Aircraft crossing oceans needed the range to complete their journeys, and the reliability of multiple engines gave operators greater confidence. The development of these aircraft also reflected the growing importance of international air travel. Airlines were no longer simply connecting nearby cities. They were establishing global networks. The world was becoming increasingly interconnected. A passenger could board an aircraft in one country and within hours arrive on another continent. This was a remarkable transformation. However, the great piston airliners were not without their disadvantages. Their engines were complex machines requiring considerable maintenance. They were also noisy and produced significant vibration. And despite their impressive speed, they were about to be overtaken by a new form of propulsion. The piston airliners reached their peak during the 1950s. Aircraft such as the DC-6, DC-7 Constellation represented the highest development of piston engine passenger aviation. But even as these aircraft entered service, the jet engine was beginning to change the future. Jet engines offered something that piston engines could not easily match: dramatically greater speed. They also allowed aircraft to fly at higher altitudes. The first generation of jet airliners would eventually transform commercial aviation. The arrival of the jet did not mean that piston aircraft was suddenly useless. In fact, many of the great piston airliners were still relatively new when the jet age began. Airlines had invested heavily in them. They were capable aircraft with years of useful service ahead of them. But the advantages of jet propulsion were simply too great to ignore. The speed of air travel could be dramatically increased. Journeys that had once taken many hours could be completed in considerably less time. The world was about to become smaller. The transition from piston engines to jets would therefore be one of the most important changes in the entire history of passenger aviation. So what was the importance of the great piston airliners? Firstly, they represented the final development of propeller-driven passenger aircraft. The engineers who created aircraft such as the Douglas DC-6 and DC-7 and Lockheed Constellation had taken piston engine technology to an extraordinary level. Secondly, these aircraft made long-distance air travel a practical reality. They connected cities, countries, and continents, and helped establish the global airline network that would later be expanded by jet aircraft. Thirdly, they transformed the passenger experience.
Pressurized cabins, improved comfort, greater range, and better reliability helped turn air travel into a modern form of transportation rather than a dangerous adventure. And finally, these aircraft transformed the bridge between the early years of commercial aviation and the jet age. They were in many ways the last great representatives of one technological era. The great piston airliners were magnificent machines. They were fast, elegant, powerful, and technically advanced. But aviation history is often defined by the speed of technological change. And just as these aircraft reached their peak, a new generation of airliners was preparing to take their place. The piston airliner had reached its summit. The jet was waiting. And in the next chapter of our journey through the past, present, and future of civil aviation, we will continue to explore how the arrival of jet aircraft changed passenger aviation forever. Thank you very much for watching John's Box. If you enjoy aviation history, historic aircraft, and the story of how civil aviation developed, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining me for the next episode in this 10-part series. This has been part 3 of 10, The Great Piston Airliners. Before we finish, here's a final word from me, your YouTube host.
So there you have it. If you've actually flown in a piston airliner, if you're old enough to remember flying in those DC-7s or Stratocruisers, you must be in your late 80s or 90s if you remember that. Please write in the comments. It'd be interesting to hear about your experience. I'm sure there's some of the early ones, the cabins were very noisy. You could feel every bump made. It wasn't as luxurious as the photos show. In the next edition then, it'll be about a new sound in the sky. I wonder what that new sound in the sky is. We'll find out in some time to come. Thank you very much for sticking in the end. Don't forget to comment, like or dislike. Your comments add to the content of the video. Thank you very much. See you again in another video on John's Box, and please support my channel. Bye.